Thanks for tuning back in for part 2 of this document. Very important document, and I'm just going to dive right in. Assessment of the legal basis for imposition of sanctions. The Special Rapporteur considers that the state of national emergency announced by the U.S. government on 8 March 2015 as the ground for introducing sanctions against Venezuela and repeatedly extended does not correspond to the requirements of Article 4 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, such as the existence of a threat to the life of a nation, the limiting of measures to the exigencies of the situation, a limited duration, the absence of discrimination, the prohibition to derogate from the right to life, and the prohibition of punishment of activity that does not constitute a criminal offense, as referred to in the Communication of Rights Experts of 29 January 2021. The Special Rapporteur underlines that unilateral sanctions against the oil, gold, mining, and other economic sectors and state-owned airline and the TV industry constitute a violation of international law, and their wrongfulness is not excluded with reference to countermeasures. The announced purpose of the maximum pressure campaign to change the government of Venezuela violates the principle of sovereign equality of states and constitutes an intervention in the domestic affairs of Venezuela that also affects its regional relations. Referring to customary norms on the immunity of state property, the Special Rapporteur reminds that assets of the central bank and property used for public functions belong to the state of Venezuela, rather than to its government or any individual. Therefore, freezing assets of the Central Bank of Venezuela on the ground of non-recognition of its government, as well as the adoption of relevant sanctions, violates the sovereign rights of the country and impedes its effective government to exercise its duties to guarantee the needs of the population. The Special Rapporteur underlines that the listing of state officials ex officio contradicts the prohibition on punishment for activity which does not constitute a criminal offense, prevents the officials from the possibility to represent the interests of Venezuela in international courts and other international institutions, and undermines the principle of sovereign equality of states. She also notes that repeated refusals of banks in the United States, the United Kingdoms, and Portugal to release Venezuelan assets, even for buying medicine, vaccines, and protective kits under the control of international organizations, violates the above principle and impedes the ability of Venezuela to respond to the COVID-19 emergency. The Special Rapporteur is concerned that unilateral targeted sanctions in their existing form violate at the very least obligations emerging from universal and regional instruments in the sphere of human rights, many of which are of a peremptory character, procedural guarantees, and presumption of innocence with a view that the grounds for their introduction do not constitute, for the most part, international crimes or comply with the grounds for universal criminal jurisdiction. While noting the fact of the submission to the International Criminal Court by a group of states or a referral against Venezuela on 27 September 2018. The Special Rapporteur underlines that applying extraterritorial jurisdiction to nationals and companies or third states for cooperation with public authorities, nationals, and companies in Venezuela, and alleged threats to such third-party states is not justified under international law and increases the risks of overcompliance with sanctions. The Special Rapporteur notes with concern the reported threats to private business and third-country donors, partners in humanitarian organizations, and the introduction of secrecy clauses in the Venezuelan anti-blockade constitutional law as concerns the identity of corresponding partners. Impact on the enjoyment of human rights. The Special Rapporteur notes with concern that sectoral sanctions on the oil, gold, and mining industries, The economic blockade of Venezuela and the freezing of central bank assets have exacerbated pre-existing economic and humanitarian calamities by preventing the earnings of revenues and the use of resources to develop and maintain infrastructure and for social support programs, which has had a devastating effect on the whole population of Venezuela, especially those in extreme poverty, women, children, medical workers, people with disabilities or life-threatening or chronic diseases, and the indigenous population. The Special Rapporteur underlines that existing humanitarian exemptions are ineffective and insufficient, subject to lengthy and costly procedures, and do not cover the delivery of spare parts, equipment, and machinery necessary for maintenance and restoration of the economy and public services. The Special Rapporteur is concerned that the application of extraterritorial secondary sanctions, as well as the reported threats of sanctions, result in over-compliance with existing sanction regimes, preventing the government of Venezuela, its public sector and private companies from purchasing machinery, spare parts, medicine, food, agricultural supplies, and other essential goods, even within the licenses issued by the United States government, and also results in a growing number of bank transfer refusals, the extension of bank transfer periods from 2 to 45 days, higher delivery, insurance and bank transfer costs, as well as reported price rises for all, especially imported goods. The Special Rapporteur notes with concern that the absence of resources and reluctance of foreign partners, banks, and delivery companies to deal with Venezuelan partners results in the impossibility to buy necessary medical and technological equipment, reagent and spare parts for their repair and maintenance of electricity, gas, water, public transport, telephone and communication systems, schools, hospitals, houses, and other public institutions, thus undermining the enjoyment of many human rights, including the right to a decent life. Despite the periodic review and increase of wages in Venezuela, the average public sector salary is estimated at $2 to $3 per month, covering less than 1% of basic food basket, putting around 90% of the population into the level of extreme poverty and making people increasingly dependent on social support by the government in the form of CLAP, food, and regular money transfers via Carta de la Patria, multiple subsidies for public servants, as well as foreign humanitarian aid. The Special Rapporteur notes that this increases the level of migration, facilitates the involvement of people in the grey economy, affecting on the first-hand high-level public sector specialists, including doctors, nurses, teachers, university professors, engineers, police officers, judges, technicians, and many others, violating their economic rights, including the right to work, to decent labor, to social security, including social insurance, and to an adequate standard of living. The number of vacancies among personnel necessary to guarantee the normal functioning of public services has reportedly reached 1/3 to a half. Massive migration in the absence of affordable transportation endangers the lives of migrants and imposes additional burdens on recipient countries. Access to food, medicine, and medical help for Venezuelan migrants, the unavailability of IDs for children born abroad, the separation of families, and the absence of due care for children left with grandparents in Venezuela have been reported, among other problems. The Special Rapporteur is also concerned that the lack of doctors and nurses and of sufficient medicines, medical equipment, spare parts, relevant software upgrades, vaccines, tests, reagents, and contraceptives, initially covered mostly by the government, results in the violation of the rights to the highest attainable state of health, rising rates of maternal, neonatal, and infant mortality, and mortality from severe diseases, oncology, HIV, hemophilia, cardiologic problems, and many others. The deterioration of living conditions for people with special needs and chronic diseases, and more adolescent pregnancies. The unavailability of resources, including the frozen assets for buying vaccines and supporting family planning programs, has resulted in outbreaks of malaria, measles and yellow fever, and opportunistic infections. The Special Rapporteur is concerned that the lack of gasoline, with the resulting rise in transportation prices, violates the freedom of movement, impedes access to hospitals, schools, and other public services, exacerbate the challenges in delivering and distributing food and medical supplies, especially in remote areas of the country, affecting, inter alia, the indigenous population, and results in delays in public services, including criminal and civil justice. The reported lack of diesel fuel, mostly used for agricultural, industrial, and transportation purposes, has a potential dramatic effect on the production and storage of food, with the risk of further exacerbating the food insecurity of the Venezuelan people, who already face a deterioration in the quality and quantity of food and greater malnutrition, increasing, therefore, health risks and threats to life. The Special Rapporteur notes with concern that due to the unavailability of new machinery, spare parts, and competent staff, the people of Venezuela have limited access to electricity, impeding inter alia the functioning of water pumps, resulting in the violation of the right to water, including drinking water and all water for sanitation, increasing risks of relevant diseases. The Special Rapporteur underlines the low salaries, the absent or inefficiency of school supplies, school uniforms, and food at school, which used to be provided by the government, transportation problems, the absence of electricity, and reduced internet and mobile phone coverage endanger the exercise of the right to education. The above reasons, as well as the reported impossibility to use online resource with Venezuelan IP addresses, affects access to information and the freedom of expression. The reported reluctance of foreign partners to cooperate with Venezuelan institutions, including universities, sports societies, and NGOs, as well as impediments to money transfers, difficulties in getting visas, and refusals to open and closing of bank accounts of Venezuelan citizens or Venezuela-based public and private companies because of the fear of secondary sanctions, affect the right to education, academic freedoms, cultural rights, and impedes the delivery of humanitarian aid. The Special Rapporteur is also concerned that shortages of gas, forcing people to cook with wood fires, can violate the right to a favorable environment. She notes that due to the necessity to guarantee human needs essential for survival, the government has reportedly suspended all programs aimed at achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, including agricultural and health projects, environmental protection, the enhancement of literacy and computer literacy, reconstruction, and others. The Special Rapporteur underlines that the blocking of property, assets, and bank accounts of citizens of Venezuela by foreign and correspondent banks, quite often because of overcompliance, results in the violation of the right to property. She also notes with concern that the application of unilateral sanctions against Venezuela affects the rights of third country nationals. In particular, the termination of contracts with third country companies has the potential risk of affecting economic and property rights of the owners and employees, and the absence of contributions from Venezuela, which used to donate to regional assistance projects, is negatively affecting the right to humanitarian aid of its beneficiaries beyond Venezuela's borders. The Special Rapporteur recognizes that targeted and secondary sanctions violate rights to a fair trial, procedural guarantees, freedom of movement, property rights, and the right to reputation. Sanctions against representatives of opposition groups for participation in elections violate their right to hold and express opinions and to participate in public affairs, while the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union offers listed persons the possibility to access the European Court of Justice, even if there are no procedural guarantees before sanction decisions are taken. The special rapporteur notes that no access to justice is guaranteed as concerns U.S. sanctions, especially in view of numerous reported refusals by U.S. lawyers to bring cases to OFAC because of reported threats from the U.S. government or fear of hypothetical sanctions. The special rapporteur concludes that sanctions imposed against Venezuela, its citizens, and companies affect people in Venezuela and beyond its territory in both the public and private sectors, third country nationals and employees of third country companies affected by secondary sanctions or the fear of them, donors and international humanitarian NGOs, beneficiaries of assistance from international organizations traditionally financed by Venezuela, while low-income people, women, children, and people with special needs or chronic or severe diseases are affected with regard to the whole scope of human rights, including civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights, and the right to development. The special rapporteur welcomes reports of the Venezuelan government's greater engagement with UNDP, UNICEF, UNAIDS, PAHO, and other international agencies and church, private sector, and humanitarian NGOs in providing humanitarian aid, facilitating some reconstruction of water systems and supplies of vaccines, medicines, tests, reagents, school supplies, and foods, thus helping around 4 million people. The special rapporteur is, however, concerned about reports of mismanagement in the distribution of humanitarian aid, surveillance and prosecution of the staffs of national NGOs involved in humanitarian works, and the absence of provisional regulation for the work of international NGOs. Recommendations of the Special Rapporteur. The Special Rapporteur reminds all parties of their obligation under the UN Charter to observe principles and norms of international law, including principles of sovereign equality, political independence, non-intervention in the domestic affairs of states, and peaceful settlement of international disputes. She urges them to settle any disputes via competent judicial and other international institutions. The Special Rapporteur stresses that humanitarian concerns shall always prevail over political ones, and that unilateral measures may only be taken with due account of the rule of law, human rights law, refugee law, and humanitarian law, must comply with states' international legal obligations, and may only be applied in the course of internationally lawful countermeasures. The Special Rapporteur reminds that preliminary and continuous assessments of the humanitarian impact shall be done in the course of any unilateral activity, as no good intention justifies the violation of fundamental human rights as collateral damage. The Special Rapporteur underlines the inadmissibility of applying sanctions extraterritorially and urges the U.S. government to end the national emergency regarding Venezuela, revise and lift sectoral sanctions against Venezuela's public sector, review and lift secondary sanctions against the third state parties, and refrain of imposing sanctions on diesel supplies that would provoke a humanitarian crisis of unprecedented proportion. The Special Rapporteur urges all interlocutors, including state, international organization, banks, private companies, and civil society, to avoid coercion, written or oral threats, or any other act which may cause or result in overcompliance, and to interpret all limitations in the narrowest possible way in the interim period before lifting of unilateral sanctions, with due account of the guidance issued by the Special Rapporteur in December 2020. The Special Rapporteur calls on all states to review and lift targeted sanctions in accordance with the principles of international law, the rule of law, human rights and refugee law, and to guarantee the possibility of state officials of Venezuela to represent the state on the basis of the principle of sovereign equality of states, and to guarantee rights of targeted individuals on the presumption of innocence, procedural guarantees, access to justice, and other fundamental rights. The Special Rapporteur urges the governments of the United Kingdoms, Portugal, and the United States and corresponding banks to unfreeze assets of the Venezuela Central Bank to purchase medicine, vaccines, food, medical and other equipment, spare parts, and other essential goods to guarantee humanitarian needs of the people of Venezuela and the restoration of public services through and under the control of the UNDP and other UN agencies. While recognizing a devastating effect of unilateral sanctions on the broad scope of human rights, especially the right to food, right to health, right to life, right to education, and the right to development, the Special Rapporteur calls the government of Venezuela and the Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights to implement fully cooperation agreements signed between them, to strengthen the OHCHR presence on the ground, and to organize visits of relevant special procedures to the country. The Special Rapporteur calls on the government of Venezuela, the UNDP and other UN agencies, and OHRHC in Venezuela negotiate an agreement to guarantee the transparent, fair, and non-discriminatory distribution of essential goods and humanitarian aid under the control of international institutions, regardless of race, gender, nationality, age, religious belief, or political views, with due account of groups with special needs. The Special Rapporteur calls on the Venezuela government, working with the UNDP and OHCHR in Venezuela, to finish drafting clear and non-discriminatory legislation enabling and facilitating humanitarian work by international and national NGOs in Venezuela, and to guarantee security and integrity of their personnel. At the same time, she refers to the obligation of humanitarian NGOs to abide by standards of purely humanitarian activity. This is an incredible document. It was an absolute pleasure reading it. I apologize for my little flubs here and there. I'm going to conclude this video, but I am going to do my own personal commentary in a third video, which I'll be uploading very shortly. I hope that you'll join me for that one. Oh my goodness, what a time to be alive.